Hi, friends. Welcome to the By Faith podcast. I'm your host, Christine Hoover, and I'm so glad you're here. Each week this season, I've invited a guest to, in the spirit of Hebrews 12:1, be one of our great cloud of witnesses to share their stories in order that we would marvel at Jesus ourselves and endure in the faith. Well, we did it. Today's episode wraps up season 5. I have really enjoyed hearing these stories, and I hope you have as well. Friends, I'm going to take a bit of a break, but I will return in mid-January with a brand new season of By Faith. Season 6 will be all about fighting sin by faith, and we will hear from people who have recognized allegiances to things like control, worry, comparison, and fear, and we'll learn from them how they are battling for wholeheartedness to Jesus. Next season will correspond with my new book, With All Your Heart. As soon as you hear my voice again in January, I will be opening up my launch team and inviting you along on the journey. But hey, there are things you can do now to share in the excitement of my new book and our new season of the podcast. You can, of course, pre-order the book. There's a handy link for you in the show notes to do just that. And if you're on Goodreads, you can put the book on your to-read list. There'll be much more starting in January, so make sure you're following along with me by subscribing to my newsletter. People who subscribe to my newsletter get first dibs on all things. Again, there's a link to that in the show notes. Okay, let's get to the show. I am so excited to share this episode with you. My guest today is Amie Patrick. Amie is married to Darren, and together they have 4 kids. Darren and Amie planted The Journey in St. Louis in 2002, and the church exploded in growth almost immediately. Darren and Amie set off on a frenetic pace, which you'll hear about in our conversation today. However, in 2016, Amie's world fell apart when her husband was confronted by the elders of their church about an emotional affair, and the elders of the church fired Darren from his role as lead pastor. Amie shares in our conversation today about what happened, what patterns that she would warn us about, and why the lack of emotional health was such a key component of not only their life's implosion, but their emotional health has been so important to their current rebuilding. Here, friends, is my conversation with Amie Patrick. Thank you, Amie, for joining me today.
No, I'm so glad to get to chat with you. So thanks for having me.
Well, I am too, because I've always just thought you were, I've always enjoyed you. I've met you once a long time ago at TGC, I think.
Yes.
I came to your talk. You talked about body image, and it was so good.
Oh, thank you.
I still remember things you said from that, and I've shared that talk with many women in my church, and just when I've had conversations about body image, that's the first thing I have shared.
I'm so glad to hear it was helpful. Thank you.
But a lot has changed in your life since that day.
That's true. Yes.
But tell us where you are now, and then we'll jump into what the past few years have been for you.
Yeah. So we live in St. Louis. We still live in St. Louis, which is where we planted a church years and years and years ago. My husband, Darren, is working with a church called Seacoast, which is in South Carolina. So he kind of works remotely and is there once a month or so doing some things for him. And we also do some speaking and consulting really around emotional and spiritual health for churches and other organizations. So my kids are continuing to get older and grow up as they do. So I now have a 19-year-old, a 17-year-old, a 13-year-old, so 3 teenagers and 1 10-year-old. So gradually moving towards an empty nest, but we got a ways to go. So.
And y'all are doing this consulting together as a couple?
Yeah, a lot of it we do together. Mm-hmm.
That's so fun.
Yes, we really enjoy it. I don't travel with him all the time, but when we're able to make that happen, then we do that whenever we can. So yeah, we enjoy it.
I think especially with the emotional and spiritual health, and did you say you're specifically speaking to pastors?
Yes.
You need the wife's perspective on that.
100%. Yes.
Which is
absolutely.
Which is what we're going to talk about today. I mean, I'm excited to get to have this conversation with you, because I feel like this is something not just pastors and wives need to hear, but everyone needs to hear.
I completely agree. Yes.
So why don't we just jump in?
Perfect.
And will you tell us, so you guys planted The Journey in St. Louis. Was it 15 years ago?
Yeah, so 2002. So we moved to St. Louis in 2001. We had a 1-year-old child at the time. We parachuted in here, not really knowing anybody. St. Louis is about 2 hours from where we both grew up, but at the time we were living in Kansas City. And I definitely went into church planning kicking and screaming. I knew we were called. Took me a long time to figure out that there wasn't something wrong with Darren, that he couldn't just be like happy in like this associate pastor position and just like that he had this itch to do something else. I thought there was something wrong with him. And I figured out probably called to plant a church. But he says that I cried the first 6 months that we moved to St. Louis, which is probably true.
Because
So
of
knew
the
we were
church
called.
planting? The church planting part was the crying? Okay.
Yes. I mean, and just all the things that happen when you move to a new city. And, at the time when we planted, a lot has changed in the church planting world since then. But at that time, the success rate for church plants was abysmal. I mean, it did not look good for you if you were planting a church then. And I just had so many concerns about, I have a baby. Are we going to have health insurance in a year? Will this even get off the ground? Like, what if it doesn't? What will we do then? And so it was just very scary for me, and trying to figure out what my role was, in the church plant. Darren is very entrepreneurial and all those things, which I'm really not. And so, you've written about this, Christine, so all these church planting wife issues.
Yes, it
All
was a
those
challenge.
things.
Yeah,
Yes,
so
yes.
it seems like, if I remember correctly, the journey grew really quickly.
It did, which we were not expecting. I always tell the story because I remember for so long, your concern is, are we going to make it? Are we going to make it? Are we going to make it? And I remember one day driving home from church in the car, and we just looked at each other and we said, oh no, we're going to make it. Like this maybe is going to go. And now what do we do?
I
That's
know
going to make
exactly
it.
what you're talking about. I remember
Yes.
having the thought, this is so crazy, probably sounding, but I remember sitting on my couch. I know exactly where I was. And I thought, oh my gosh, this makes me a pastor's wife. Like when we have an actual established church, which
Yes.
is happening, that means that my husband is the pastor and I am the pastor's wife. And it just kind of freaked me out.
Yes. It sounds very adult, the whole thing.
Yes. Like this is on our shoulders. We got to keep this going. It's not just a 3-year deal. This is like, we got to keep going in this thing.
Yes, absolutely. And so, so we made it. And then we had really crazy growth for several years, which was amazing and so hard at the same time, which, you feel so conflicted even saying it that way, because you're talking about people coming to Christ, which was amazing. There were people really getting connected and using their gifts, but keeping up with the structure of that and trying to make sure you're caring for all the people that are coming, that you're really equipped to do that you have all those things in place, was a constant battle. And just trying to figure out what to do next and how to manage it was a continuing challenge. Yes.
So how was it hard for you in those years?
Well, I think what we call it now is just the idea of displacement, in that, sometimes you will hire a person to come on in a staff position who is great for that position for what it is then. And then in a year, what that position needs to be has completely changed because your church has changed in a year, and that doesn't work anymore for that person. And so relationally, we had a ton of staff changes, structure changes, and just trying to figure out how do we make this work, which plays out relationally for the pastor and his wife. Because, I can remember several times it being, okay, this is going to be our group of people. And a year and a half, 2 years later, okay, now this is going to be, our group of people, because structure had changed and we'd added staff positions or elders or whatever that might have been. And so that was very hard to navigate relationally and to figure out who are my people. And I understand why it has to change, but I don't want it to. And that was really hard to know what to do with.
Were you feeling lonely?
I think I mean, yes, there was loneliness, but I think it was more overwhelmed and just trying to understand my role and figure out what I needed to do to keep up with it. In light of, we added 3 more children to our family, in the time that we were, and, just the day to day of a family and a marriage. And it was pretty overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So have you ever read Andy Crouch's book, Strong and Weak?
Yes. Yes.
There's a
Great
chapter
book.
yes, very good. There's a chapter in there that I don't remember much about it except for that chapter, and I remember everything about that chapter
Yeah.
because it talks about that leaders have hidden vulnerabilities.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that just gave me words for what I experience. And basically for anybody who's listening who hasn't read it, he's just saying that leaders have their things about their position or their role, and it doesn't necessarily just have to be ministry positions, but anybody who's in a leadership role, that most people think of them as strong, that they don't have weaknesses or vulnerabilities. But the truth is they're people, and they do have them.
Yes.
But some of most of those cannot be shared in a public way. They have to have people that they can privately share that with. But I'm wondering for you, what over the course of the church plant, the church growing into an established church, those years, and that was probably like over the course of 10 years, what were some of those hidden vulnerabilities that you were experiencing?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that we understand much more in retrospect than we did at the time. And some of those are things that we would now say are maybe signs of unhealth that you want to watch out for. Even so, some of those things tend to go together. But a big piece of that for us was the pace that we were running at. And a part of what was confusing about pace to me is that Darren, even when he is at his healthiest, runs at a much faster pace than I will ever run at. We're just wired very differently in those ways. So it was hard for me to be able to look at him and go, what's just you and that's different from me? And when does this get into unhealth? Now, after the fact, we can look at some things and go, that was definitely unhealthy. In the course of that, really from like 2001 to 2016, we added 3 kids to our family. We had 6 campuses at our church. We planted 8 churches out of our church. Darren was the vice president of a church planting network, wrote 5 books over that time, finished his doctorate degree, started several nonprofits out of the church. I mean, it's insane. And these were things at one time that he probably would have taken a lot of pride in. And now we look back at it and go, that was crazy. And that was not healthy. But he did not really understand, the things that were driving him to just keep pushing at that pace and to keep starting new things. And it's hard to argue when they're good things, and they're things that are making a kingdom impact. And so, we ran at a pace for a long time that was just not healthy for either one of us. But that was hard to see and hard to know how to deal with at that time. And I think, in some ways I enabled that without meaning to, because I wanted to be helpful and pick up the slack wherever I could and support him and do what we needed to do, so I didn't, obviously that's kind of the definition of enabling, is you don't realize you're doing it. You don't mean to.
I like that you pointed out that it's hard because they're good things.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of times, especially, or maybe it's for everyone, but in ministry, I've experienced this where we say to ourselves, these are really good things, and I want to be selfless, and I want to sacrifice for the Lord and for other people. But it can become unhealthy. So how did you, looking back, how do you see, or how would you draw the line between this is good to I'm enabling unhealthy behavior?
Yeah, I think what we did not do is come up with some markers that were just sort of signs for like emotional, spiritual, physical health. Like, how do you know you're running at a healthy pace, and what those really look like for Darren and what those look like for me. And then establishing, we all hit seasons where we just have to run faster than probably what is healthy for a time. I mean, it happens and can't be avoided. But looking at how long can we really keep this up before this has to end, because it's going to, deteriorate into a place that's really destructive for us. I don't think we knew how to do that. I know we didn't know how to do that. And so I felt a little bit of a loss at saying, I don't know if we're really running at a healthy pace. Well, how do I know if that's just what I would prefer, the pace that I would prefer to run at versus what he would prefer to do. So I think those markers are really important to talk about and kind of have some boundaries around before you're running out of control.
Because it did go out of control.
Got out of control, for sure.
2016, your world just kind of came to a crashing halt.
Yes.
Can you tell us what happened?
Yeah. So, I will just tell you the specifics about the day and then I can talk a little bit about it. So it was the first day of our kids' spring break in March. And I kind of noticed that Darren was not, I have his calendar on my phone and likewise. So we kind of keep up with each other and know what we're doing. I'm like, he's not really doing what's on his calendar today, but that wasn't all that unusual. But later that day, he called me in to his office in our house and our counselor was there and, just sat down and told me that the elders had confronted him at that day about an emotional affair that had been found out. And that was sort of the tip of the iceberg of just kind of an implosion process that had been happening with Darren for a while. And so that was a horrific day. I said to him in that conversation, I said, I think that life as we know it is over. And I didn't even know what I was saying, when I said it at the time, but that absolutely proved to be true. And for about the next month, we were in a process of kind of trying to figure out what was going to happen next. Nobody knew what was going on. Our kids didn't know what was going on.
Wow.
Other than just there's something going on, but clearly, but we're not getting the specifics about it yet.
Nobody in the church knew besides the elders.
Right. Easter happened during that time. So you can imagine all of that. And a month is a long time, when you're kind of working through that process. But because, there had been things that the elders had been concerned about for a long time and things they felt like had kind of been a pattern for a long time, there was this process of trying to figure out what to do next. And so then that April, about a month later, early April, they decided that Darren was going to be fired and no longer be senior pastor of the Journey. So that was kind of what happened through that time. So it was a combination of, when we say implosion, it was just a real leadership failures, real lack of emotional and spiritual health. Darren's dad had passed away a couple of years before, and there was just a lot of unhealed wounds there that had kind of risen to the surface in ways that Darren wasn't even totally aware of. So really just imploded on a number of levels at that time. Yeah.
Did you know leading up to that, were there signs for you? Were there things that you felt dissatisfied in your marriage or you noticed about Darren? Was there any sort of indication that he was not in a good
what
place?
Was coming?
Yeah.
So I think, I'll say first, one of the biggest struggles for me initially was feeling like I should have been able to prevent this. Like I should have seen it. What did I not see? What did I miss? I should have been able to prevent this. And, and all 5 of the counselors that we worked with on our process, had to say to me, Amie, you could not have prevented this. This is not your fault. And you couldn't have prevented it, which took me a long time to accept. But was also very freeing, to realize that. I think, what I tell people a lot is that it was almost like I was standing by one door or 2 doors, even looking for signs of unhealth, and it kind of came in different doors that I wasn't paying attention to. Or I would say that a lot of the things I saw were very common struggles that we talked about a lot with other pastors, particularly, in our situation and wives. And so were there things I was concerned about? Yes. Had they reached a point where I was so concerned that I was like, we have got to do something radical right now? Not really at that point. And when a person, this has been a big learning for me, when a person really isn't aware of what's going on internally with them, they don't talk about it because they're not even aware of it themselves. And so it's pretty hard to be able to see all these things when a person is really living unaware, which Darren most certainly was.
I would imagine as a wife, just in any conversation husbands and wives have, you say, hey, this or that, or,
Sure. Yes.
Like, let's talk about this. Was he willing to have those conversations? And
yes.
Okay.
Always. Yeah. So we were definitely, we're pretty regular about confronting each other on all kinds of things. So, we had tons of conversations about things. And Darren's a very persuasive guy. So I always had to deal with that piece of it. But, I would say from what I was aware of, they felt like pretty normal conversations in the perspective of understanding the stress that he was under, the things that he was dealing with, that he was handling the best he could. After his dad died, there were all kinds of signs of grief and things that I was looking for, didn't really see that. So we were having all of those conversations, and there were concerns, but to me, they were all under the realm of, I can see how this is happening, and we're not reaching a point from what I can see to where we got to call up an audible here. But, things are much clearer after the fact, and there are a lot of things that we've revisited in the conversation since then.
So what have you revisited? What are some of the things? Help us as listeners if we're thinking, hey, this is me, or I can relate. I think a lot of people can relate to what you just said. So what are some of the things that you tell pastors and wives now about what you wish you would have done? Or what are some of the patterns that you would have changed?
Yeah, well, I think pace, which we've already talked about, is a big one. I would say, under the area of emotional health, there was a lot that we didn't understand at the time. And I think our paradigm was more one that, or my paradigm was one that if you have good theology, that'll take care of most of it, which I'm a big proponent of good theology. And I'm always going to be a big proponent of that. Let's be solid there. But I think there are some areas of common grace, kind of from the psychological world and from neuroscience and several other things that that are consistent with good theology, that we need to have a lot more understanding and incorporate. So, when we talk about the realm of emotional health now, Darren was very good at anger, not great at sadness and fear, really did not know what to do with those things. And so they came out as anger a lot. And I had an inkling of that, but really had no idea what to do with that. And so we've learned a lot about experiencing all the emotions, and that emotionally healthy people really regularly walk through all emotions. I think you can make an argument that Jesus experienced and walked through all the emotions when he was on earth. And so, that was something in retrospect. I mean, I knew he was angry a lot. I also knew he struggled with anger in different ways than I do. So it was hard to know, what do you chalk up to temperament differences, and when do we get into you're not really exhibiting fruit of the spirit here anymore. But a lot about sadness and fear that he just didn't understand. I didn't really understand about him and his story. And so we had a lot to learn and walk through, and a lot of wounds that needed to be healed in that area. Yeah.
I think it's hard. Like everything you're saying, I'm like, yes, I agree. And then I think, but it's so hard as a pastor. I mean, I watch my husband, and like, where can pastors, what space do they have to be sad and to be, fearful and to express those things? I mean, do you think that contributed some? Did you feel that, or did he feel that, there wasn't a place for that, or he just didn't want to turn that faucet on and think about it?
Yeah, I think he didn't know how to turn that faucet on, which goes, just way back into his story and growing up. And I think part of it is that the fear is, if you go there, you have no idea how to get out of it. So if you really go there, there's no getting out of it, and it slows you down tremendously.
Yes.
If you really wade into being sad and afraid, or whatever, the emotion may be that you're not really comfortable with. But the reality is, that we've really learned, when you don't regularly experience and work through emotions, they become this thing that your life is built around. And they, as afraid we are of being controlled by our emotions, they control us when we don't deal with them in ways that we don't often understand. And so I think it was just a not knowing how to go there, not knowing how to work through them. And because there were years of that he had to really work through, it was a process that was very painful and slow to work through. Yeah.
Which makes sense why he would be so active and doing all these things. It's like outrunning the emotion. If I can just work and do all this. But what about you? Were you emotionally unhealthy? And would you say?
I mean, Darren and I are very different in our wiring and in our stories. So I did not struggle, in the same way that he did with that. I think we all have areas of emotional unhealth. Now, I had to learn a lot about my own anger, because I did not experience anger a lot, but I also just kind of had a moral problem with it. And so didn't really go there enough appropriately. So that was something as a part of our process that I really had to do a lot of learning about was my own anger. But I, just temperament wise tend to be a little more, let's just float through it and, figure it out. And so I was more comfortable with sadness and fear than he was, but there are always things to learn about that, as you're walking through those things. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So going back to that day in 2016, when he tells you this, I can't even imagine the thoughts and things that went through your head, the emotions.
Yeah.
But there's this component of it that was very public because Darren is a known person. I mean, he wrote books and he was speaking at conferences and he's a major person in Acts 29. And I mean, it was on Twitter. It was, people knew.
Yes.
So that's another component for you, I would imagine. Tell us what that was like for you. This is a very personal, private thing, but then it's public too.
Yes. Yes. It was awful. It was really awful. Yeah. So, we had reporters coming to our house and leaving their cards on our mailbox. There was a front page story in our local newspaper. And, there was an article in Christianity Today. It was everywhere. And, we live in a city where everybody doesn't know us, but we run into people that we know all the time. So we really couldn't avoid that. And, life goes on even when these things happen. So I'm still picking kids up from school every day, and going to the grocery store and, doing all the things that you have to do while going through that. But it was just really horrific. Before it even went public, I think I lost like 20 pounds in 2 weeks, could not eat, could not sleep, ended up going to the hospital for all kinds of physical symptoms that were just related to the stress and anxiety, went on anxiety medication, which I had never had to do in my life. It was a really horrific time.
So in that month, did you tell anybody?
Yeah. So I had, our counselor was involved, which is great. And then I have a really close friend who was outside of the journey at that time, which was really actually helpful that she wasn't there at the time, who I just got together with regularly and unloaded on everything. But other than that, I was pretty limited in who I was able to tell or talk to at that time, other than our immediate family and, the one friend that I could go to and our counselor, which I'm so grateful I had anybody at all, because sometimes in these situations you have no one. But it was very limited and definitely felt like I had to hold it together, in ways that were really, really hard.
So relationally, when it did become public, was it kind of jarring for you and just,
Oh, yeah.
Did people respond? Like, I would love to know, I always wonder in these kinds of situations, what would be helpful for you?
Yeah.
How does someone reach out to someone like you in that moment?
Yeah. So that was a very interesting part of it for me, because I had a lot of people. You were one of them. You sent me a very sweet text. I specifically remember it. That was so great. I had a lot of people reach out to me and be very kind, and people that reached out in very appropriate ways, given the context, of whatever our relationship might have been. We had people who, I had people who brought food over and just did, amazing things like that. We live in a pretty close-knit neighborhood, and I just emailed a ton of my neighbors to tell them what was going on, because I knew it was a thing and I was going to see them out publicly and had to. And I had, several neighbors brought over food and stood and cried with me at my front door and just were really precious and wonderful. But the painful part for me, if I'm honest with you, was I had a lot of people who, in various ministry circles that we were in, around the country, around the world, who I did not hear a word from, and many who I have not heard a word from since that time, which was, I was so surprised. I mean, if I'm honest with you, some of those relationships were really meaningful to me. Like, I considered them my people. And so, some of that I can chalk up to my own kind of naivete and, idealism about ministry, but it was really surprising in a very sad way to me, that there were so many people that I heard, nothing from at the time.
It seems like that kind of thing compounds the pain of the situation. It's like
Yes.
piling on pain.
Yes.
And that's why I asked, because I want people to think about that. When somebody goes through something painful, I have found, and even in my own life, I would be afraid to say something because
Yes.
I don't want to embarrass them or make them feel worse. But in reality, by not saying something, it makes it worse.
Yes. And I, as much as I had the thought of what in the world, when that happened, I've done the same thing to people. I had to turn it back and go, I've done this. I've looked at situations and said, gosh, I have no idea. Like, that seems like such a mess. I don't even know how to even wade into that. What would I even, do I have enough of a relationship? I don't know. Maybe it'd be better not to say anything.
Yeah.
And if there was anything I learned in that, it's do something. Like, even if it's to say, I don't know what to say, but I want to say something, is better than nothing. The silence in those times is just terrible, was extremely painful. And so I am, on the other side of that, I am really grateful for the gift that gave me of knowing the importance of presence with people and of just doing something, show up in one way or another. And I think for me, I know a lot of times it's my fear that I'll do the wrong thing. And then maybe they'll be mad at me or upset or mean to me even in the moment, if I do something that's not helpful. That's my own problem. I can move past that and go, I'm going to at least try.
Yeah.
To show up anyway. Yeah.
So in that moment when he was fired, your whole life changed. I mean, I think that may be something for somebody who's listening who's not a pastor's wife. So much of your life is intertwined, your social relationships, your church community, his job. And so suddenly all of those things are gone.
Yes.
So how did that impact you? Because if I'm imagining, I'd be really mad. I mean, mad about the betrayal, but mad that what you did has upended our whole life.
Oh, for sure. Oh, I was so mad at him for a long time, which was appropriate, I would say, and necessary. And I had to kind of work through a process of going, how does this work when your life gets, destroyed by the actions of somebody else that were not your fault? In many ways, it would have been easier if I could have found a way to blame myself, because at least then I had an explanation. But I really hadn't had to kind of think through theologically, honestly, how I felt about my life is in pieces because of you and because of your sin and behavior. And so how do I reconcile that? Which was a long process, of working through that. And we can, we believe in the sovereignty of God, and I can talk about God working all things together for good. And, but really experiencing the pain and the devastation of that, and then having to move to a new place of, do I really believe that? Do I really believe that God is working for my good, even in here? And what do I need to know about myself and see from this that this situation is producing? Boy, those are big, hard questions to work through at a time when everything is disoriented in your life.
So what was y'all's first step? What happened? What was that how did that process begin? Did you know right away that you wanted to work toward reconciliation with him and forgiveness?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes. I mean, I told him in the initial conversation, I said, I'm telling you by faith, I'm not going anywhere. Okay. Like I'm in it with you. So, but we had to work through a process where I knew he was being totally honest with me about everything. And we had to get to a point where he demonstrated enough self-awareness and humility and, willingness to acknowledge his own stuff deeply that I saw a path forward. And that just takes a while, to get to that. So there were some very difficult days and conversations in there where we had to get to a point where, how are we moving forward here? But that was always the goal, is that Darren be, restored to faith and health as a person, period. And then our marriage, second after that. Anything else after that was peripheral completely, because there was just a lot of work to do on all of those things. So pretty quickly, both of us entered a process of counseling and all kinds of other things, related to a restoration process. Darren stepped down from all internal and external ministry. So he had no ministry activity at all for like 14, 15 months, which was a big change from all of the things that he was doing prior to that. So yeah, so that was kind of the first step, is just stepping down from all of that, really getting into some intense counseling for both of us, and then surviving, honestly. He was severely depressed, suicidal, in bed a lot of the time, just absolutely, devastated in every way. So it was a long walk out of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What about your kids? Because
Yeah.
they were old enough to know, and this is public, it affected them too. They lose
Yes.
their church community.
Yes.
So
that was awful. We, in that initial month, we had several conversations with them, just kind of telling them the basics of, there's some things going on here that they needed to know. And then after Darren was fired, we had to have, a much more intense conversation. And we talked to our older girls were 15 and 13 at the time. So we talked to them together, and then talked to our two younger kids separately, because our younger kids at the time were, 9 and 5. So,
wow.
Just really different,
Mm-hmm.
we got kind of a wide range there. And so really different places of engaging with it, and appropriate levels of like disclosure and honesty about, based on what they can understand and receive at those ages. But we were as honest with them as we could possibly be. We cried a lot together. We really tried to just show up and be available to them for whatever they needed, and talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. Any emotion was acceptable as far as what they needed to express and deal with and say to us, and all of those things. But it was awful. Those were some of the hardest conversations, I've ever had in my life. I remember early on in ministry when we started having kids, and I just, God, you can, whatever you want, mess with me however you want, but please don't mess with my kids.
Yeah.
But also knowing that, this was part of their sanctification process. This is part, God has a plan in this for them, which we reminded them of continually. And I say that not in light and fluffy ways, but really, God is present with you just as he is with us. And but it was, when there's an article on the page, front page of the paper about your dad, and you're going to public school every day, there are things we got to talk about.
Wow.
So yeah, it was a very, very painful time. They had a really great youth group worker in their life who would just take them out, spend time with them. They didn't have to talk about anything. But she just really loved on them well during that time. And that made a tremendous difference, just for them to see that there was someone who cared about them and was willing to show up for them. That was a big deal.
Y'all didn't stay at the Journey?
We did not. No, we did not.
You went somewhere else to church?
We didn't go anywhere at church for quite a while. We couldn't, we tried. And our teenage daughters, particularly, like anywhere we walked on the door, it was just, we immediately burst into tears, and it was just such a painful experience. So, so that was a hard thing to figure out how to navigate.
Yeah.
Too. Yeah. Really hard.
What would you say was a turning point for you in this counseling process? I can't remember if you said it now or you said it to me before, but you had kind of a team of people trying to help bring restoration, all that. Was there anything that was said or a moment that you remember that was kind of a turning point for you, where you realized you could kind of see that there's hope at the end?
Yeah. So I think, we worked with a couple of really great counselors at a ministry called Crosspoint Ministry in Louisville, Kentucky. And those two men, Rich Class and Jim Cofield, were amazing, fatherly, kind, said harder things to us than anyone has ever said to us in our entire lives, but in the context of a lot of hope for us in the process. And I think when we started to get to more of the roots of everything that was going on with Darren, I think that was a big turning point. And there was a lot of work to do after that. But I think just kind of understanding the context of sin has to be repented of, obviously. Wounds need to be healed. And in our kind of theological tribe, it had more been about, everything had kind of gotten called sin at times when there were wounds underneath that really needed healing. And those are two different things. And I think we've learned that, sin tends to grow out of the soil of unhealed wounds. And so understanding the connection between those things, and that there was clearly a lot of repentance to do, but there was also a lot of healing that needed to be happening was really helpful for us and was a big key in moving forward.
We've talked a lot together today about emotional health, and I would love for you to define what that is and how can we cultivate emotional health?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I would say, in general, we talk a lot about there's a bigger relationship between emotional health and spiritual maturity than I think we made previous to this. And so a lot of it has to do, I think the initial step is just becoming more emotionally aware within ourselves. One of our counselors said to Darren early in the process, they said, Darren, you have a low tolerance for negative emotions. Which we were like, what? But then it, made a lot of sense when we talked more about sadness and fear. And so, as I said, even understanding what does it mean to experience emotions in a regular way? What emotions do we tend to avoid? What are those things we just never go there? Why is that? Gets us to some of the deeper parts of our story that God really wants to heal and redeem. But if we don't have a context for that, we kind of never get there.
Do you have any resources that have been helpful that we could ourselves read, or, is there anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, there's a great book by the counselors that I mentioned that's called The Relational Soul. That was extremely helpful for us. I think this realm of emotional health is becoming more and more of a prevalent topic in, Christianity overall. I think because we're seeing more and more, there's something missing here that we haven't quite landed on, and the lack of it is causing a pretty big problem overall, I would say. Yes. And so that's one resource I would recommend. But anything that kind of gets you in that realm of looking at emotional health through the lens of obviously appropriate biblical categories, I think is really important.
Yeah. I think that's so good that it's becoming more of a topic, because I myself have realized at certain points in my life, I don't like negative emotions. I don't know how to talk about them. I don't know how to reconcile them with faith and trust in God. If I feel negative, it feels wrong. Like, well, I'm not trusting God. But in reality, that's not necessarily the case. And so I love that you guys are consulting others about this. And which brings me to a question is, where are y'all now and how are you doing and all that?
Yeah, so we're still in St. Louis. We are, kind of talked about the work that we're doing to this point. We're in a good place. We're definitely still in a place of what exactly are we doing and what is God doing next and where are we going? We don't have a lot of clarity on all of that, but I mean, in some ways I'm like, do we ever in the Christian life? And being open to, whatever God might be calling us to next, I think is a good place to be. So if a lack of clarity means that I'm more open to whatever is, God is calling us to, I'm okay with that. But we're in a good place. We feel much healthier, much more stable. I would say our marriage is better than it's ever been. And I don't say that lightly because we fought hard for it to get there. Our kids are doing well. So we are very grateful to be on solid ground. And, we don't take it lightly that a lot of these stories like this don't end the way that ours has. Not that ours is over, but don't come out this way. And so we don't take credit for that, but we also, we're humbled because we could be divorced today. We could be in a much different place than where we are. And so we're extremely grateful.
Were you nervous about him taking on this monthly role with Seacoast Church?
No, I mean, fortunately, Greg Surratt, who's the pastor of Seacoast, was on Darren's restoration team. And so really walked through the whole process with Darren and has known him for years and is such a great fatherly man. And, Seacoast was so good to us and is still so good to us in just loving us, loving our kids, being safe, just being amazing. And so I completely trust Greg. And I knew that he would, Darren stepped in a very limited way and with a lot of accountability and supervision and all of those things. And so it's always, anytime you enter into something like that, there's always an element of, well, what are we doing and what could happen? But I completely trusted that Darren was going into a safe situation that would be good for him.
Good. That's so good.
Yeah.
Last question. Now that you look back at all of this, how do you see God's hand in this? And what have you learned about him in the process?
There's a lot I could say about that one. I think, and I want to disclaimer this statement because there are many worse things that can happen to people than what has happened to us. But we survive things sometimes that we don't want to survive, and we would rather not. And yet here we are and we keep going. And so I do feel like I've learned a lot about walking with God in a time when it is really dark and when it stays dark for a while. I think sometimes when we talk about suffering with people, we either get way optimistic too quickly about things getting better, or, I feel like I've heard a lot of just get before the Lord and just wait and he will show up. And he does show up, but I can tell you I had many days where I was before the Lord for the whole day and it felt like he had left the building, completely. And it was really by faith that I was believing that he was who he said he was and then he was around. It did not feel like he was in any way whatsoever. And I understand, I think much more that that's a very normal experience and that going deep with him in those times builds a kind of, like steadfastness and you, like James 1 talks about, it builds a kind of resilience in you when your roots go down deeper like that. That's not about self-sufficiency, but it's about believing God is who he says he is when you see very little evidence of it for an extended period of time. And so I really felt like I hadn't heard a lot about that or didn't understand a lot about that until it was my situation. And so I try to say that as much as I can now that, gosh, kind of the middle of hard things is just awful. It really feels awful, but God is still there. And he is working way underneath the surface, just like he does in the middle of the winter, when it looks like nothing is happening. So I think I've learned a lot about his character in ways that I didn't expect.
I'm so encouraged talking to you today. Thank
you.
I mean, we're talking about hard things, but what you're saying, what you've learned, when you talk to somebody and they've learned something out of the hardest experience. So what they're saying, that you just want to like grab onto all of it and just hold it. That's how I feel talking with you today. I'm so thankful that you guys have done the hard work of working through everything when you didn't have to. You could have run. He could have run, but you both you did the hard work. And I'm thankful.
Oh, thank you.
You're bearing the fruit of that now.
Thank you. Me too.
Thanks for sharing your story, Amie.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Christine.
I am grateful for Amie's willingness to share so openly with us, and I'm grateful for you, my listeners. Each season, I really enjoy having these conversations with such a variety of people, and I really love producing this podcast for you. I'd especially like to thank my Patreon supporters who have made this season possible for me and therefore for you. Friends, I look forward to another season of By Faith starting in January. Until then, keep walking forward by faith.